Gerg and Muxel, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in games, how they work, and why we love them. I'm Gerg.
And I'm Muxel.
And a very spooky hello to everyone, because it's now Spooktober.
Yes, get ready, guys. There's so much spookiness happening.
Get ready to get wrecked. Dude, I found... Oh, man, I know we'll get into it immediately because we don't want to be one of these podcasts, but I found a really excellent set of skeleton GIFs, memes.
Ooh.
And as I say GIFs, get over it. Have you ever seen the GIF of... this one I couldn't find. I actually found these ones looking for a different one.
Uh-huh.
But it's it's a 3D, like, poor animation, but it's like a door to a house, like a living room of a house, and then the door bursts open, and it's this conga line of skeletons with party hats going nuts.
No, I have not seen that.
I think some of them has trumpets. It's really good. But yeah, it's like the caption is like 12:01 October 1st.
That's fantastic.
Horde of skeletons coming in. So today we are going to be doing a interesting look. We're back to our horror themed spooky casts for the month of October, all month. And our first one is going to be a topic I'm excited about, inspired by not a horror game, but applied to them. We're going to be talking about negative space in games, specifically with a little bit of side horror movie commentary, because I watched a movie this past weekend. But, yeah, you want to talk about just exactly what we mean by negative space? I mean,
Sure.
It's pretty self-explanatory, but...
Yeah, well, so I had initially envisioned negative space just being like physical space.
Right.
But the discussion really broadened out as we talked about it, and it turns out negative space plays an important role in lots of ways. So we just mean the absence of something in particular. Like, usually it's going to be in reference to some sensory thing,
right.
but it actually comes up in a number of places that aren't even sensory. They're just sort of abstract.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it sounds like something we would do.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, I mean, in general, a lot of horror, I think, tends to be very much the presence of something that is scaring you, as opposed to the absence of other things. And I think in our kind of precast discussion, as we were brainstorming, it turns out that even a lot of the more kind of typical... We could kind of apply this to almost any of the games we were talking about. It wasn't just specifically games that were designed kind of like the movie Gravity, right? That's meant to invoke the horror of literally endless space in this case, with Gravity.
Right.
But something like that. I mean, so the first thing we talked about was kind of Subnautica, game that we've played a decent amount of, and had some pretty extreme reactions to despite not being a horror game, the initial nights we had to spend in open ocean were weighed very heavily on Xander and Mark.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, not you at all.
Yeah, not me at all. I was the one who was like, come on, guy. No, I wasn't like that. I was like, yeah, maybe wait one night.
Yeah, well, and because this is a discussion just about how horror plays itself out in video games, regardless of whether they label themselves horror games.
Yeah.
But Subnautica has got some spooky parts to it.
Oh, absolutely.
And I
really
want to...
deeply unsettling.
Yeah. Well, and you remember where we went down, like, to 200 feet?
Yeah, oh my god!
Yeah.
Dude, I just... yeah, that was...
So
finding that...
A little bit of a spoiler, but in Subnautica, we went down pretty deep in the water, like 200 feet, and we just encountered this, like, sea
banshee witch thing.
And it just freaked us out.
It was so disturbing, because it was standing still, and, like, it was just the outline of it, and then, like, it was kind of the classic, like, you're looking at it, and then your brain, like, recognizes what it's seeing.
That you're looking
and it
at.
immediately became, oh my god.
We just immediately fled the other way.
Yeah, we just immediately surfaced.
It's important for this discussion because we were literally in the middle of just open water.
Yeah.
Like there was the ground was probably like 60, 70 feet below us.
Oh,
we had like it. We couldn't. We had so much space in front of us we couldn't see because we're in pretty deep water at this point.
Yep.
And we had a clear column of water to the surface above us.
Yeah.
So like we're in a completely open space, but we were still really spooked. And I think that sometimes like you would think that like if you can see everything around you, then you're not going to be spooked.
Right.
But I think what makes this discussion interesting is how you can sort of circumvent that and either still scare people or actually can enhance the horror.
Yeah.
Depending on the sort of situation you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a semi-shameless plug, but we really did come up with I think we had some pretty good casts last year in October for horror. I would definitely encourage you, because even as we were talking, we were drawing on some of the stuff that we had come up with last year and reasoned out in terms of the games we played, and so I definitely recommend listening to. I think a lot of our ideas are I think those are the deepest horror dive I've ever done in my life, of a full month of watching and playing horror things
podcasts.
and then talking about them for 5 hours. So I think we'll be drawing on a decent amount of those ideas in terms of just in terms of the way that scares get set up and tension is built and kind of anticipation and power, particularly for games, and the ways that that's really important to give a player in very small doses, if not at all, to maintain fear. So anyway, we'll be talking about some of those. And so go listen to the old ones, because I think we did some good work there. But I did want to the interesting first kind of contrast that we have a decent amount of contrasts for this, but was thinking about the fact that in some cases, right, big open space is not inherently scary, right? It, like if you stand at the top of the mountain in a game like Skyrim and you look out, that is not horrifying.
Yeah.
There's nothing inherent about, and similarly, you pointed out there's nothing inherently scary about closed space. Like that would be what we would call cozy,
right? In
a good way. So I don't want to make the claim that just big open spaces are inherently scary. They don't have to be. Mm-hmm. That being said, space usage in terms of that negative space, I think, as we were looking over some things, can really be observed well depending on the way that the game is using its space in general. So think about like Outlast, the game that Mark and I streamed, which is set in this asylum, basically, and you start outside of it, where you have kind of infinite space around you, not really, but you're outside at least,
right? And
you are forced to go in, and the less and less space you have, the more and more terrifying it gets, right? That game is very much based around this feeling of claustrophobia and being trapped, and not having any ability to fight back, and so you just have to run, and you're in these confined, scary spots, and that's scary.
Right.
The interesting thing with that was that even within so there's a section where you get up into the air ducts and you're in very little space.
Oh yeah.
And that was, I remember that I on stream is me sitting there as you're continuing to play it, and I'm trying to hype myself up to go into the freaking air ducts. I don't remember, you didn't see that, but I was just sitting there for like 3. That's why I was behind, so far behind you, is because I just sat there trying to get the courage to go into the damn things. And obviously there's a few scares in there, but then at one point in the game, after kind of the starting area, you get kind of into like this main hub where you have a little bit more freedom about where to go.
Right.
And it's bigger. It's just open. It's a big hallway, basically, a big kind of like foyer area. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I remember, and again, you can watch this in the stream when both Mark and I get to this point, there's this immediate kind of release of, we're like, okay, there's some level of safety that came with space in this case, with more space. So I think in terms of a game that is trying to get its scares out of tiny space, more space is going to feel better.
Yeah.
Similarly, talking about Subnautica or Soma, or not Soma, sorry, but Subnautica, but a game that gets a lot of its fear out of the big emptiness. When you get into your pod in Subnautica, suddenly the fear dissipates. Even there's an area where you have a little bit more structure around it. You kind of are exploring this crashed spaceship. Mm-hmm. And even that felt slightly more, definitely less unsettling than being out in the open water exploring, because you had limits.
It feels a lot more known to be in a small space.
So it seems to be kind of an inverse relationship between, if the game is primarily going to be trying to keep you in small spaces, then opening up space is going to be helpful, and the opposite. If the game is primarily trying to scare you with a large space, then a smaller space is going to feel more comfortable. So I think it just goes back to, like I was saying, there's no inherent spookiness about either one. It's just the way it's utilized.
Well, and a game that seems to fit a very similar theme to Subnautica, you mentioned before on accident.
Oh yeah,
Soma.
Right.
And Soma is very claustrophobic.
Right.
It's also underwater, very nautically themed.
Right.
But here the threats are mostly in hallways and like cramped corridors and things like that. And so it just goes to show that like a pod or inside of a ship doesn't have to be cozy.
Yeah.
But it feels kind of that way in Subnautica because all the threats are sort of from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the other thing. So Soma's interesting in that it kind of has both. You have no real indoor play space for
that's true.
Subnautica. Soma has... you do have those outdoor sections, right, where you go out and you're in the ocean, and you probably don't have kind of the full swimming freedom. You're walking and kind of jumping like you're on the moon. but you're still outdoors. And that feels, I mean, that's a little bit of best of both worlds, right? Where that is, again, not a scenario where it felt comfortable to be outside. Like, it wasn't like, hey, I'm claustrophobic, now we're finally out into the ocean. Woo! Thank God.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's an interesting, that's an example of both and kind of in that regard, where it's not quite as simple as being one or the other for the game. And I think a lot of the stuff, like in the example with Outlast, what I was talking about, that was at the end of a narrative part, and it was pretty clear due to the pacing of horror that, hey, we're probably in a slower portion here where we're going to have a little bit more puzzle solving or a little bit more kind of figuring out what to do next, as opposed to just, like in the first beginning, you're just walking down the hallway basically, and 3 different hallways,
crawling
and
over
waiting,
and
waiting until someone's going to murder you, and that's almost what happens. So, so there's other things that go into it, but I do think that level of that inverse property is, if a game really plays into trying to keep you in one of them, then the other one, I think, would be a natural way for it to disperse some of the tension.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you play some horror games this month, I encourage you to pay attention to how space is used in the pacing of the game, or to sort of suggest a pacing in the game, right? Like if you're in this super cramped, like twisty hallways of a game like Amnesia, and you emerge into a large open room,
right?
I think your expectation is probably like, okay, we're probably taking a step back for a moment here, like maybe not forever, but. And they might circumvent that, like they did in Soma, where they're like, you think you're taking a break, but then this big old swimming monster comes by.
Whatever the heck this thing is. Yeah.
And so, like, they could still mess with you, but I think it does suggest a pacing to the player.
To go back to the Soma example, too, another reason why that might be, you know, again, there's multiple things that go into horror. We kind of reduce it down to 1 or 2 things per cast, but obviously all of these things work together. Another thing with Soma, I think that is interesting with why the outdoor scenarios are also scary, is because you have way less power. In that regard, too, you have way less mobility. You don't have. I don't think you have the ability to do anything. Like you can't access your tools or interact with things. You basically
just move super slow,
hop through the water to the next gate. I think.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing, is that again, power. You know, stripping a player of power is a very easy way to make you feel scared. And so I think it's another piece with Soma there. I think the other one to talk about was the other thing that comes along with video games being a pretty primarily visual medium. I think comes along with negative space, or just space in general, is that you get more, you have more opportunity for just incoming information.
That's true.
Right, that we were talking about, again, a version of power I would say would be the amount of information you have about an area that you're in, particularly for a horror game.
Oh, yeah.
And being in a bigger open space, in theory, like again, so like in Outlast, when you get into this place, you can see the entire hall, and you can see the doors, and you say, okay, you have a semblance of your surroundings. Mm-hmm. Here are where things can come from to kill me.
Right.
You have some control and power there. You have a lot of information that's coming in, as opposed to in Subnautica, in an open space, you actually have very little information. If anything, you have less information because anything could come from anywhere.
Right, exactly.
Right? Like, that's even worse than being in a place where you know where something might be. We were talking about that with Left 4 Dead, right? Like, being in the middle of nowhere in Left 4 Dead and having just zombie hordes come out of nowhere is way more horrifying than actually being in, like, a hallway and having some semblance of control over knowing where they're going to be coming from and being able to adapt.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really true. Like, and I mentioned this before about just like one of the reasons why water is so unsettling, just sort of inherently for human beings, is that we're not really used to even thinking on that many planes
and 3 dimensions.
Right? We're used to thinking on sort of a flat plane. That's how we move and navigate. Yeah. So adding water just adds an extra set of unknown attack vectors, basically, for animals to come.
That's actually fun side note here, as my Star Wars nerddom will be full throttle here. But so the Admiral Akbar in Star Wars, he's called Mon Calamari. He's just a squid person.
Okay.
And they are aquatic, right? And they grew up in the ocean, so they can think in 3D. They can think in 3 dimensions. So that's why they're these, in the lore, they're notoriously excellent space. They're really good pilots and admirals because they can think in the 3 dimensions of space,
right?
As in a fleet engagement, as opposed to humans have a hard time reducing that. Ender's Game is really good at talking about that too, if you ever read that book.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the Mon Cal are so good. They're always the fleet masters for the rebels because they can think in 3D, having grown up in an ocean environment.
Interesting.
Which is a cool little thing that no one cares about. But in any case, yeah, you're absolutely right in that regard. But yeah, the power dynamic, I think, in space, as we were talking about with Left 4 Dead, Mark, you were talking about just having being more vulnerable in a larger open space. Having less cover, particularly like Left 4 Dead is slightly unique in terms of it being more actiony, and you have a lot more power in that game. But even like in a game where, say again, you're trapped with a monster in Amnesia in a big open barn, like you're done, you're screwed, right? Like you have nowhere to hide. Like most of the time, games will use some semblance of hiding mechanic, or running or getting around, and that a big, large open space can very easily give a sense of powerlessness.
Right. Space.
Even if you can see.
An open space takes away places to hide. Right. There's no cover. It takes away the ability to sort of know what direction you're going to be attacked from, which we mentioned with like the ocean is like compounds that even more. But even think about being in the middle of a parking lot, and like you see people on the fringes who are look threatening,
or hearing things,
right? And then it's like, okay, well now it's really easy to get surrounded in the middle of an open space. Obviously a little harder if you're on like a mountain peak or something, which is why I think that is a less. It's more empowering to be on a high point of an open space
than a low point. That's a great point.
At a low point in like a valley, it's really easy to get surrounded and have the low ground.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the scene in Mulan, right, when she sees like. She's in the mountain. All the ones like
just
come up on the ridge,
over the ridge.
It's such a great shot where she keeps on looking and they keep on, and then it's entirely surrounded.
So those seem like the main things that like open spaces have going for them as a horror element.
Right, absolutely.
You also can fit large monsters in big areas.
Yeah,
I know that's kind of like a weird like side point, but it's true. Like if you're in a small hallway, your monster's got to be small.
Very much so.
Now, small monsters can still be terrifying, but like you don't get the like Cthulhu-esque scale of something unreally large in a little hallway.
Oh, totally. I remember actually even that in God of War when you'd go, obviously not a horror game, but like if you came into a giant arena area, odds are you're going to have one of these giant boss fights, right?
Yeah, of course.
Because they were so much larger. Especially in the early games, it was pretty clear when they were shepherding you into what was going to be an absolutely gigantic encounter, because the rest of the game was pretty tightly spaced, actually, in terms of the combat.
Well, before we move into like more abstract representations of negative space, I also want to talk about how you can sort of have a faux closed space by limiting vision and lighting, right? Like lighting is huge in horror games,
right?
And in a game like Subnautica, like it's very, very open objectively, but as you descend, you can see less and less. And so the space that you actually can perceive is feeling much smaller. And the reason that matters is because it gives you less and less time to recognize that something is in your space.
Yeah.
Right? Like if I have great vision, then I can tell like when something is going to be in my, and like how close something is and when it's going to be in my space.
Yeah. And
if you don't have like hardly any vision, then something might all of a sudden be in your personal space that you didn't even know existed. Right? Like
personal space.
Personal space.
Rick and Morty.
Personal space.
1, personal space. 2, personal space. 3, gotta have that personal space. No, that's a great point. And in fact, I was even thinking that there's some level of like that faux tightness or closeness is like is scarier than a true closed, because the outside, if you know that it's faux closed, right? If you know you can only see a little bit of this gigantic area, the possibilities of what out there are endless, right? As opposed to I think that Silent Hill does that, right? In terms of the famous fog that covers the town. In terms of that area, that space of the town, just by being decrepit and having horrible things in it, isn't inherently scary. Right. But suddenly just limiting how far you can see in the darn thing, and it's true of real fog, makes it a whole lot scarier, because there's this level of not knowing what's out there in the mist. Or if there's anything. So that's interesting that even if you took the objectively same amount of visual distance, just knowing if you know it ends at a wall in a certain game, then that's like you don't have to worry what's past the wall, right? You just have to worry about what's between you and the wall, as opposed to if that same distance is in a game like Subnautica, where it's between you and then where the light stops, you have to worry about that space, and then all the infinite space past that where anything can come from,
see,
and get something to come into that space. You don't have any more boundaries. So that actually that's interesting that despite the fact that it's functionally in some ways not even functionally, that it is literally the same amount of visual information that you have.
Right.
Functionally, is very, very different in terms of the way that the player will perceive it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you process on that level too. Like,
Yeah.
you think of fear as being a pretty basic instinct, but when you think about the things it's perceiving,
Yeah.
it's pretty complicated.
Yeah.
To think like this is like what I'm seeing is like limited, but it's not limited by anything impermeable.
Right.
So like something could come
So
through.
hence, yeah. I should be more scared of this identical area of space.
Right.
Because I know that there's something that could come from somewhere else as opposed to, this well-developed rules. Now, of course, you can subvert that by having something come through a wall in a horror game. But in general, that, doesn't happen, so...
I actually had a moment where it was just super foggy here. We're in Michigan right now, going through fall, and it's...
dude, yeah, was that... It was like... It was not too long ago, right?
Yeah, it was just a few days ago. It was like eerie.
Oh, it's the best. I love fog.
Oh, I mean, I enjoyed it, but I was just walking back from like the mailbox, and there was a car parked in the parking lot with its headlights on.
Yeah.
And like normally, there's no way I would have even paid attention to it. But the way that the headlights pierced through the fog, it seemed like some sort of otherworldly like... creature.
No, you were super aware of
rear up and attack me.
Yeah, of what was about to happen.
And like the way that the tree branches split the light coming from like the apartment. Cool. It's so cool. But anyway, it might be kind of tangential. But at least it involves fog. So there you go.
Well, not very much. So. Nothing to build ambiance like fog. But yeah, no, that's an issue. I mean, even again, talking about space, literally, this is kind of similar. But I was thinking about BioShock and how that game is far more. I don't think most people would classify as horror. It's closer to action, but it has horror elements for sure. And a lot of the horror comes from a lot of the direct stuff that happens. There's a lot of horrifying events.
Yeah.
But even past that, a lot of praise was lumped onto Rapture and the setting being at the bottom of the ocean, this decrepit. I think We Just Fear Old Things too is set in like the 50s, I think, when Rapture went under. So it's this weird kind of old. Decrepit, horrifying place at the bottom of the ocean. But the interesting thing, what I wanted to say was that in terms of, they could have done the exact same game, basically, in like an underground or in a dungeon,
right?
In large part. There's actually very little that is necessary about being at the bottom of the ocean for the story. And that would be just, I think, infinitely, one, less interesting, but two, far less, I think it would have been a lot harder to classify as horror, because there was a level of being able to see outside of, if there were windows at any point, you'd see out into the open ocean. Mm-hmm. And you'd get this incredible sense of aloneness and depth, obviously, but just the weight of being truly trapped and in this completely alien environment.
Right.
On top of then all the normal claustrophobic horrifying stuff. So again, it's this weird thing where, despite the fact that I don't think the game itself, in terms of the gameplay spaces, use a whole lot of negative space to get scares. It tends to be more kind of upright horror and then a lot of atmospheric psychological stuff that the game uses. But just knowing and seeing, being constantly reminded of that gigantic open space outside of it does make you feel more trapped in the space than you would otherwise, I think, if it was just, like I said, a complex, cavern or whatever. So that's I think that's very telling and interesting. That contrasts to space, especially when you've established like the one that you're kind of going for, and you can still use the negative space of the open ocean to enhance that feeling of claustrophobia, as opposed to just making it feel like they're disparate,
You can borrow the isolation, which I think is another facet of open space I want to touch on. That like when you're in open space, obviously, if it's a really open area, you're isolated, because like there's nobody around you. And that, as we talked on previous horrorcasts about how humans are just very social creatures, and having people around us is a huge deal. And if you can see really far in any direction and you're definitely alone, that's a place where actually having the information and knowing that you're alone can increase the horror element.
And
absolutely. Like that's what you're talking about in like Rapture, where you like look out the window and you're like, nobody's coming for me.
Again, that's a fascinating level of, there's a lot of processing that happens there unconsciously. When we look out the window and just feel immediately uneasy. But to some level, there's probably a part of our social brain that's freaking out of aloneness and what that means. There's a level of like spatial reasoning that's happening. Mm-hmm. Our brain's quite the monster.
And I think that you actually could term. Then this might get into the places where we're sort of pushing the term negative space. You could call that social negative space.
There you go.
Right? Like there's nobody around you. There's
or just
no
isolation.
Relationship. Also known as isolation.
No, absolutely. The lack of something that is very, very necessary for humans to feel okay. And that's basically what we're talking about in every direction. So yeah, social negative space is very, very powerful. I think too that I was just thinking about this, the level of, because think about like there aren't too many horror movies, at least that I know of, that really utilize the big open negative space concept. Is like I can think of like Jaws is a classic. That's fear of the water.
Yep.
And then Gravity is not a horror movie by any means, but it's deeply unsettling.
Yes.
And I don't recommend people watch it lightly because it is very, very scary. But other than that, I couldn't think of like a whole ton of set piece horror movies. If anything, it's very much the opposite. And I think that makes sense when you think about the difference between movies being non-interactive and games being interactive. In the case where, regardless of the feeling of open space you have in a movie, that you have no control over the way it's used or where it's going, or really you have no skin in the game, right? You have no ability to even. You have no say in what the character does.
Right.
You are along for the ride. So even if there is some level of just natural, like I said, kind of unconscious recognition by your brain that, hey, this is the way the space is being utilized in this area and that feels good or bad, it's not, there's no opportunity there, right? And so in a game, you actually can explore infinite. Like there's a very different, I'm trying to lock down exactly why it feels so different to me, but the idea of being able to control where you're going in space definitely seems like it would affect the way that you would fear or not fear the amount of space that you have.
Yeah.
Like I don't think about that in movies quite the same way, and it doesn't seem to be utilized as much with fear as opposed to what we're talking about with games. Is super important.
It does seem like it's interesting that the information doesn't mean as much in a movie.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you're given a lot of space, you can take in a lot of information about your surroundings
and what that might mean.
Feel
for
more
threat
prepared
analysis.
because you're going to react.
Yeah.
In a movie, you're not going to react.
Yeah.
Right? You're just going to watch the boneheaded character do something stupid and get eaten or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So that might be part of it.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think that's everything.
I think that's a big part. I think that's a big part of it is the difference in terms of, like you said, if there's in so much as there's some level of depowering with information, then getting a lot of information in a game is important because, like, if we are in a movie and again we have no say what the character does and we can see exactly all the bad decisions that they might be making, like having more information doesn't help that. For us, doesn't help that character.
Right, exactly. It doesn't.
So there's no reason for that to be utilized, right?
Yeah.
By the filmmaker to the audience, other than potentially setting up a scare. But
in fact,
it's a very different type of scare happening there. That's anticipation with a payoff, as opposed to powerlessness being stripped away and then having to deal with how you're going to respond to that. And we talked about that a little bit, even in terms of the fact that horror games require agency. Yeah. Where you have to, the only way it gets scarier is if you keep on playing.
Right.
And you can pause it, and obviously you can do that in movies, but like there's a different level of...
You're making this happen.
Yeah, oh totally. Yeah, exactly. You are directly responsible for the fact that you're scared right now,
Which I actually, that jumps ahead a little bit, but we talked a little bit about when we were planning about causal negative space,
I think
right?
I think it's the favorite one that we came up with.
Like,
this is so abstract.
It's really abstract.
Causal negative space.
Causal, right? Doesn't that sound like a section in theoretical physics?
Yeah, that's excellent.
But causal negative space, we're using it to just refer to the fact that if you don't initiate something that's going to happen, probably nothing's going to happen to you. Right? Like, there's some horror, like parts of horror games where, like, if you sit there long enough, something will happen.
They'll come and find you and kill you, but...
Right. But, like, I would say for a majority of horror games, if you stand there, nothing happens.
Put down the controller,
probably
going to be pretty safe.
And so there are certain mechanics that game developers have put in, like amnesia's torches and things like that, like meters that can run down and try to push you along.
Yeah.
But this is a real problem for horror game designers, right? They want to get you to keep moving through the content because
that's the way you.
Well, that's how you advance, but also like I think it's more unsettling to push yourself through the horror than to just sort of like sit there and take it.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Because that would be like more like a movie where you just kind of sit there and bad things happen.
And that totally changes the pacing too, right? Like we talked about pacing and anticipation, and that tension building is so important in horror to get effective scares. In a movie, you have complete control over that as the creator.
Right.
In a game, you have very little in some ways. You can only count on the player continuing to play and then build it around that, basically.
Right.
Which, in some ways, is empowering for the player because they can stop at any point and make the fear stop. But at the same time, makes it really, really difficult to continue to make, as from a creator standpoint, pace your scares
because you want them to feel like good enough to keep going. But you also want them to be scared because that's the whole point.
Well, and you were talking about even like on another, I think maybe even another level of abstraction here, but talking about like the like in Outlast, right? You start, like you said, you're a reporter heading into this asylum, and you drive up to the asylum and you get out of your car, and that's when you start controlling it. Right. And you have to like break, like you have to, like it's not easy. You have to like break into the asylum, basically.
Right, exactly.
You have to like utilize problem solving mechanic. Like if it was just kind of like, okay, get in here, not really. All right, let's call it a day. It's like, no, we're gonna figure this out.
Yeah.
Like it requires this level of agency from the player to force you into going to do this thing that you, again, as the player, you are completely aware that this is the worst idea that anyone has ever had in the history of ever. And that negative space of you doing something that's directly damaging to your character, but also like your mental health.
Yeah, exactly.
Is really, really interesting. Using that level of that dichotomy, where you, I remember us both talking about that. Like, this is such a like, why? And like that fact in itself was causing us distress.
Yeah, no,
we were
exactly.
like being forced to go do this thing. Like, there's something about not like being on the rails even, or having a sequence where you're getting chased and you don't have any control over being chased and you have to figure it out, as opposed to being the person who is making decision after decision that's leading you into this obviously terrible situation.
Yeah.
There's an extra level of mental fatigue, I think, that goes into that.
Yeah, it's like unsettling. That's interesting because, like, obviously, it's so interesting that like you have the decision from the outset, of course, to experience the content or not, right? Like, if you really didn't want to go into the mansion, you just wouldn't have booted up Outlast, right? Like, so it's almost like the developers are asking you again and again to reaffirm, like, yes, I want to be scared. Yes,
which is so hard to do.
It is.
Like, it's so much harder. It's like that's like for a movie, you kind of have to do that once almost,
right?
And then you just can be passive, and it's going to happen. But like you have
that's why you can like close your eyes in a movie, right?
Exactly.
It's like you can tune out.
Yeah, you just have to make the choice, like, hey, picking the movie, then putting the disc in, and pressing play, and then you're done. You can just like huddle, and you can just like be scared. But like in a game, it's like, still want to be scared?
Yeah, you want to be more scared?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this was pretty bad. You want more? That's a great point. That's a very difficult. Humans don't respond well to that when we're given an adverse stimulus. Being asked if we want to continue to have that adverse stimulus,
right,
is a much harder thing.
So that's a little bit on causal negative space. I just think it's a fascinating idea in general, like in video game or in horror games, like how little happens without you being there and without you acting.
Yeah,
and like even like the worst things usually happen in reaction to you. Like you walk into a room and then a monster attacks you. Right? It's not like the monster was like having a good time and then you interrupted him. I think occasionally that'll happen, but it's usually more the second. Like things are waiting for you. The world is waiting to respond to you. So in that way, you're super powerful. But it's.
But that level of power, that's a different level. That's not that's like a causal level of power, like it's a...
and the response, once it does come, is so much greater than you.
Right, yeah.
That's
that strips away immediately. But that is interesting, in terms of the fact that nothing happens outside of you, your agency is actually very extreme in a horror game. That's very interesting. And obviously that is, I think that is true across... That's not even just in terms of like an action horror game like Left 4 Dead or like Dead Space is a little bit more action. It's combat based, or a game like Outlast or Amnesia, which is entirely puzzle, hide, run based. Both of those, you're right, have that thing. I think that's part of the game's the job of the game too, to really mask that. The fact to make it feel like you have no choice but to be doing the things you're doing,
right?
Outside of making it very clear that you're picking these horrible things. And I think certain games do that well, and I'm sure there's a lot of horror games that don't do that so well. That feels very contrived. I think the closer it feels to like, this is what would make the most sense in this scenario. Like Outlast, we were like, this idiot. Like what? No, there's no possible reason why you should be doing this.
Oh yeah.
As opposed to like Amnesia. You wake up in the middle of this castle, you have a note from yourself saying, go down and kill this dude. You've done something horrible. Your first response is like, okay, I should get my bearings and probably look around this kind of creepy place. You know, I shouldn't just stay here. Like,
Right.
there's some level of your actions amnesia make more internal sense.
Yeah, you're not subjecting yourself to it in the same.
Yeah.
It's not like it's not self-sadistic or self-masochistic
Yeah.
in the way that like Outlast is.
Yeah, I was just so... And I get, like, after the intro, now you're just trying to escape and survive, in theory.
Right.
But it was just a level of getting into that in the first place. And I'm sure there's different levels, too, of doing things the way he did that might not have been entirely necessary, and so on and so forth. But so that was our first level of abstraction when it comes to different types of negative space as opposed to just the physical. Mm-hmm. You look beyond the physical.
One of the I think I want to take a little bit of a tangent to talk about some of the enemy and monster dynamics, and we're going to talk more about enemy design in a different podcast this month. So spoiler for our own podcast. But some of what influences what's freaky is sort of what threats have you been introduced to.
Sure.
Right?
That's a good point.
If you've been introduced to fast hordes of zombies, then an open space is really vulnerable because they're faster than you and they'll catch you and kill you in large numbers.
Yeah.
If you've been exposed to sort of a slow, creeping, freaky sort of creature, then like a closed space where one could just sort of crawl into view is going to be really unsettling.
Yeah,
but like an open space is going to be great.
You can just be like, all right, I'm gonna
run away from
get the frick away from this thing.
Exactly.
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, that's a great example. That's a really interesting. And yeah, absolutely. In terms of the expectation of what you're going to be coming up against, really matters when it comes to space too. Mm-hmm. And I'm also just struck by it is primarily the way that the creature traverses space, not necessarily the creature's design. It's the way it moves.
Right.
Its relationship with space affects yours.
That is really fascinating.
It sounds so.
we're getting so abstract.
I know. It just also sounds so pretentious, but I think it's true. I mean, the way that other things interact with the space around them is what will cause that space to be scary or not scary to you.
Yeah.
In the case of like you said, having some gigantic, slow lumbering thing, being able to interact with that in a large open space is going to be far more empowering and freedom filled than being in a small space where you are trapped by this thing. Right. Right. That just makes sense. That's so interesting.
I mean, if we sort of pull on this thread a bit, like I think being near a whale in the ocean would be freaky.
Yes.
I have no reason to believe a whale would hurt me.
Oh, no.
I really don't think that they would. But I still think it would be so unsettling to be around something that's so large and potentially unaware that you exist.
Yeah, very much so. I'm trying to think of like in Shadow of the Colossus, right? Like that game, you engage gigantic things in large part in large spaces.
Right, and then they weren't particularly quick or agile.
No. Well, they're just smaller ones, but those aren't really... That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the colossal ones.
Yeah, not the bird or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. There's like a dog one. I remember that.
I don't remember that one.
That was annoying. But, did you play that game?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. I didn't know if I was asking if you remembered something from a game you didn't play. Like, oh, yeah, no, I don't remember that at all.
No, I played
because I didn't. Okay.
So, like... when we were talking about the walls versus the fog, right? So if a creature is very quick, then even if you know that you have a large amount of space around you, it functions like a smaller amount of space.
Yeah, that's we're getting like space-time theory now. Like, if the speed's high enough, the space actually isn't there. Like,
because like the amount of reaction time you have still could be relatively small.
Still very low,
right? Like if you have like a spider coming at you from across the room, it's like okay, you've got to take a nap or whatever.
Right.
Like eventually it'll get to you or whatever.
Right.
But if your fear is like being attacked by this lightning fast machine or something, knowing that you're in a large area doesn't help you very much because it could still be to you within seconds.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Or like guns, right? Like having someone point a gun at you from across a football stadium is still unsettling.
Yes.
Because that bullet's going to be there before you can react.
Yes. It should be anyway.
And so that's very different than somebody with a sword who's on the other side of a football stadium, right?
That's a great example.
It's still freaky. They still might throw the sword at you if they're really good at aiming swords, but like it just feels less threatening.
Well, that can be also an idea in terms of the way that you can use those expectations against the player. You know, like introducing a new type of enemy in a previously thought known space. Like
Right.
a player thought that they had an idea of the way that they were going to be interacting with this type of space, and then a new enemy comes in that's either faster or slower or less, less obvious what it's going to be doing.
Right.
Could immediately, could immediately. I think we'll see a lot of this with Dead Space, honestly, because Dead Space 1 has a lot of different enemy types, and 2 has 0G sections.
Oh yeah, that's
because you're in space.
So yeah, by changing up like specifically the locomotion of the creature, you can subvert expectations and sort of create some unsettling dynamics.
Yeah. There's one instance of this that I think it will happen early enough that we might get to on stream.
So we are going to play Outlast for anybody who's catching on. Dang it, Dead Space. We've already played Outlast. We will never do that again.
Yeah, that's not high on my list. Although we still own it, right? Like that's permanent.
You're not wrong.
That's true. But so we're going to be playing Dead Space on stream. I've played through it. Mark has not. I played through it like 6 years ago.
Yeah. So
tops.
I hope it's still freaky for you.
So
it will be freaky for me.
I imagine it will be.
Okay, good.
This will be an interesting discussion too when it comes to talking about power and repeated exposure to what used to be scary things and why that will begin to... The game will become less scary the more you play it.
Right.
It has to work really hard to maintain that level of initial fear that you're going to have when you boot it up and you're just learning what's in this ship and the ways you can interact with it. Even though it'll keep on introducing new types of these, what do they call them? Zombies. Basically zombies.
Creatures, yeah.
It still is harder and harder to keep up that level of tension as the game goes, because eventually you find out, hey, I've gotten pretty good at killing these things.
Right, you start to feel more powerful.
Yep. But anyway, that's going to be a good example of that. Spoilers. The last thing I want to talk about was, again, kind of in terms of reaction time before we move into the next negative space discussion, was I finally got in on my PS4, which means I'm playing Arkham Knight, and I'm just over the moon excited to be playing it, and it's fantastic, and it's everything I was hoping it would be, seeing as how I've been waiting for this game kind of since since Arkham City came out and I beat that. So it's like 2011, so it's been like 7 years.
Oh my gosh.
Basically, that I've been waiting for a true sequel to City. Anyway, point is, one of the really cool things, again, spoiler for a game that's 3, almost 4 years old, and it's not even a huge one, this happens like 25% of the way through the story. Batman gets dosed with a massive dose of fear toxin, and he begins hallucinating Joker following him around, basically. So at any point in the game, Mark Hamill's Joker will show up and he'll comment on what's happening, usually quite brilliantly and darkly. I love it. It's really brilliant. But the way they've instituted the game is cool in terms of the tech that they have, which is similar to the we talked about the Sherlock Holmes, the Slenderman.
Oh yeah,
Sherlock
Watson
Holmes
glitch.
Yeah, the Watson glitch. But where you can look at, basically you can turn a corner and Joker, you're in a hallway, you turn a corner and Joker's sitting there on a box and he's talking to you, and you pass him and you're going about doing whatever you do, because you can't interact with him, and you're going about doing whatever you're doing in the room, and he stops talking and you look back and he's gone. It's all in perfect real time, to the point where if you're looking at him and he stops talking, and it's clear that he's going to disappear, he won't disappear on screen. So you can literally just jerk the camera left and right and it'll be gone. Wow. Instantaneously, and they can do that in both ways. So we're talking about information being a form of power, or having being able to get a sense of a space will give you some level of, hey, this goes into the reaction time thing with enemies. Like, hey, I see this space, I see this enemy, I know how fast they move, I'm in control here. Right? I have an idea of what this space means to me.
Right.
If it's fast, maybe not much. If it's slow, then I have time. The interesting thing they do, and they do utilize this, I won't talk about the exact way they utilize this tech for Arkham, but is that they will, you can turn a corner and they can show you space, and then you can, again, just look. It's a 3D third-person action game, so there's tons of camera movement that you don't even really pay attention to as you're getting getting the idea of where you are as you enter a new room, right? And you can look at the space and it's entirely one thing, and you can look back and be back very, very quickly and can be something entirely different.
Right.
So it is, and like I said, they'll utilize that a few times. So it's really pulling it's a way of pulling the rug out under the player of, hey, here's this space, you have an idea of what this means, just kidding.
Yeah,
you got it, basically. And that's gotten me, there's been several instances where that got used really effectively. And again, not even in a jump scare way, but something was there, that was not there a split second ago, and you didn't see it appear, and you believed that space wasn't gonna. You didn't have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah,
it's very disconcerting. Where you're like, gee, oh my god! Even if it was, and they've utilized that very, very well, and the attack is really smooth. In the game, and it's really cool. So I think that ties in pretty well to what we're talking about.
Yeah, that violation of the expectation there,
Yep.
you feel like you knew.
Yep, and it's a very simple one too, right? And so brilliant because it has an in-game, like I said, it's just a hallucination.
Right.
So it has an in-game that is obviously impossible, or would be very stupid in a Batman game to have teleporting enemies.
But it creates in the player the same fear that Batman would be experiencing under the fear toxin,
Yep.
right?
No,
which
very
is
much so.
super cool.
Yeah.
And I think that's art at its peak is when it can convey an emotion that the subject that you're viewing is also having.
When you
I
are
love
mirroring the experience of the character, like literally. That is not just invoking it, but like actually having a similar response to what the character would be. That's
it really
impressive.
makes you feel like Batman.
Oh my god, I'm gonna punch you.
Okay. Well,
last point, sorry.
Oh, sure.
I mean, so another thing that we haven't quite mentioned a whole ton is, which I think we won't have quite as much time for as we'd wanted to initially, but another sense of negative space would obviously be the soundscape of a game.
Right.
Silence as negative space, and the other thing I was going to think about, particularly with that Arkham example, is that there's no sound cues at all for the Joker appearing or disappearing, or like I said, some of the other ways this tech has been used. There's no cue. So in that way, again, something that if something was going to get into this space based on all the other rules of the game and all your expectations, some sound would have to be made.
Right.
Sound's really important in the game in terms of the sound you make as well as enemies and stealth and all that jazz. So again, it just shatters. It breaks right through that and says, we're not going to play by this particular rule, and that's really, really scary.
Yeah, it just appears there completely silently.
Yeah. That it removes from you both the visual, like I said, the visual kind of, hey, I see this space, it should be fine, but also I hear this space and it should still be fine. So it's violating both of those.
Sound is an interesting sort of sensory negative space because it's unsettling and like just sort of on its own, right? Like, so visual space, it can feel unsettling again if you have the right combination of like enemies or if you sort of have a low light or a fog sort of effect. But like sound, like having it be quiet almost seems unsettling from the outset. I mean, in general, I like silence. But in horror games, it's so pervasive that like the only things you hear are the things that you're doing.
Yeah, that you want to hear, or the game wants you to hear.
And I kind of wonder how that fits into like the permeability speed conversation from Vision. Like, what does it mean to be like fast in the sound sense?
Yeah. Right? Like how do you threaten?
Yeah,
more so with sound.
I'm not sure.
It's interesting. I mean, it could play a little bit into, depending on if you're using headphones or not. A lot of times sound can be used for distance, for space. Where to hearing an echo as opposed to hearing a footstep behind you. Very different experience. That can be used to, but that's more judging 3-dimension. I mean, it's more like 3-dimensional space as opposed to like what you were talking about in terms of sound as a medium.
Volume might be the closest analog to distance.
Yeah, volume and tenor. Like the way echoing or not, basically, right?
Which really, it's interesting because that really gets into like psychoacoustics and how we perceive sound. Like if it's really quiet, then any sound will sound louder. Yeah, which might be more threatening. Yeah, right. Like it's almost like, okay, this doesn't happen in visual space, but imagine this: the further away that something was, the faster it would appear to move. Yeah, right. Which is the opposite. It's the opposite of how space works, but it's exactly how sound works. The quieter it is, the louder other things seem to be. Yeah. Which is
relative to each other,
right? So that's why you would want it to be quiet.
That's interesting, as well as you think about like music, right, in games and the usage of music to cue different things, both in terms of the music itself as well as not having music whatsoever.
Right, just having it cut out,
just having entire silence for an area. And I feel like depending on the sequence and the type of game, where you have a game that's super super atmospheric and maybe a little bit lower on. Like Amnesia pretty much has music, I think, at most points.
Oh yeah.
Really creepy ambient, very low key stuff, but I think it always has a track going, and even when you're the scary stuff, when you're getting found, there's this scary music that plays. I'm trying to think if like something a little bit more up in your face, like Outlast, was, I think mostly, I don't think there was any music there. It
I don't
was
think
just
there
silent.
was.
And then think about strategic use of that music in Amnesia. I'm sure there's moments where it cuts out, and that's horrifying in its own right. That's such an interesting thought of the fact that quiet is relative as opposed to like, I mean, speed. Kind of.
Yeah. And,
Or
even like the way that distance affects,
and just the way that your brain processes things.
right?
Yeah.
Like your distance affects our perception of things. Get like quadratically smaller as they get further away.
Well, if you think about like just the image that's projected onto your eye, actually, that actually scales well. Right?
Yeah.
You see something that's small that you think should be bigger, but it's smaller on your eye, so you assume it's farther away.
Right.
And then similarly, if that thing's up close, that's an objective. You can have a large thing that is far away and a small thing that is close, and actually have the same exact like
Perception.
yeah of this. Maybe not. You don't perceive them differently,
Right.
But they would have the exact same. Think of it like a sticker, right? If you like had two stickers and then you took them off and you put them close together, they would appear to be the same size.
Right.
Woo! Alrighty.
I just don't know. I thought you were going to end on a different point.
Sorry, that's all I got. You just keep that in.
So
Okay, so let's go to our last one.
Yeah, the last thing we want to touch on. You want to talk about this one?
Sure. Yeah, this was the last one that we. So it came to our final. As we were talking, as we were on a roll, and we were kind of like, okay, so how does Doki Literature Club use negative space? And I was trying to think, and because that game is so far, the only thing you interact with in that game is basically decision-making narrative, as opposed to three-dimensional space or sound, or really kind of doing anything other than making choices. So hence we were like, okay, so there's got to be some level of negative space narratively that gets utilized as is horror. Again, I pretty truly believe that a lot of horror has a lot of kind of underlying mechanics, similar to like physics almost, you know? Like, and if you can describe them well enough, then you can describe a lot of different pieces, and Doki Doki is definitely horror, and yet didn't really fit into any of the categories that we'd come up with so far. So, do you want to talk about... we both came up with different versions, even, of negative space, and how Doki Doki utilized it. So, Doki Doki spoilers, I guess, but...
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Doki Doki Literature Club it's played out in a series of scenes where there's just text, and then you see different figures appear and disappear on screen. It's set up like a graphic novel. And I noticed that there was a lot of negative space at the beginning of the game. So if you watch our stream of this game, the whole first part is basically us wondering if it's going to be scary or not.
It's like, what, 3 hours? How long did we do that for?
Yeah, it was 2.5 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
It was a long time, and we didn't get into anything that felt very spooky, right? There was parts that were like slightly unsettling or weird, but it wasn't like, wow, this is a horror game. It was just more like, did they intend for that to be scary? I'm not sure.
And we were so well kept in the dark by our own, choice,
yes,
I suppose, that own volition, that we were legitimately wondering whether or not it was actually a horror game or not.
Right, or if we'd sort of been tricked.
If we'd been
it was before
bamboozled.
Everybody knew that it definitely is a horror game. It was early on enough.
It's like 6 days after it came out.
And so we had that moment where we were just sort of narratively floundering. Like we're just making decisions. We don't really know what they do. We don't know if we're like picking a scary path or if there even is a scary path.
Right.
And so you're given a lot of room, but it's a little unsettling because you don't really know where this is going. And we had some hint of like it could be scary. And so I think that's what I was thinking of when we talked about negative narrative space, where you give the player a lot of options and you make them feel responsible for what follows.
Yeah.
And they may or may not be, right? Like we've talked about the ways that games can do decision diamonds, and players' choices may not actually cause a
meaningful deviation in the narrative.
Right, but you can make them feel more responsible because, like, look at all this control I gave you.
Yeah.
I let you pick, like, 30 decisions, and then this is where you ended up. It's something horrible.
Yeah.
And I think there's an increased weight of, like, I did this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, too, the sheer amount of... And this is, again, something I think we might have missed out on a little bit in terms of our not necessarily knowing if it was going to be horror or not. Something we talked about in one of the previous casts will be the horror creator's job is to simultaneously tell you that you're going to be scared, but not tell you when, why, or how, basically. So you have to have the expectation that this is going to be scary, otherwise it'll just be a jump scare. And those can be scary for a split second. Right. Or you're just going to have this very long atmospheric thing that never pays off, and pretty darn quickly in that, once you realize that, hey, they're not going to do anything scary, all tension's lost. So, in terms of Doki Doki, we were reflecting on the fact that had we known 100% certain that it was going to be a horror game, that first 2.5 hours actually probably would have been far... Like, if you watch our stream, we were probably pretty darn lighthearted through the whole thing, especially when we realized that it was very unclear if we were playing a horror game or not, actually.
Yeah.
And there was very little tension in the whole thing. There was a lot of more joking, and there were 3 of us, so that helped. But at the same time, it just would have been way scarier had we known that it was going to be something where we absolutely knew we were going to be scared, as opposed to just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop during the whole process of having nothing happen for roughly 2.5 hours. That would have been... far more tension-filled. So that that negative space of having nothing happen narratively, but also giving us decisions, is deeply unsettling in some ways.
Right, because when
the other stuff comes.
Right. Yeah, and when you make decisions, you expect like things to happen in games, right?
Yeah.
Like typically, I think a pattern in games is you get involved with like important decisions.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, they weren't.
Yeah.
Right? Like they didn't go anywhere.
No, not at all.
But you had a different idea for negative narrative space in Doki Doki. You want to
talk
about that?
Yeah. No, it was funny. We both came up with the phrase at once, and then had different ideas of what I was thinking about. I was thinking more in terms of the level of not being able to be... We have very little freedom in terms of what's happening, as well as in terms of your viewpoint of what's happening. And there was a whole lot of... at least I remember, again, you can go back and kind of watch, where we had a sense of where the narrative was going to be going, but we weren't there yet. And it was very, very deeply unsettling in terms of, like... So, one instance, again, spoilers, where one of the girls disappears for a while, and it's different than the past time, because you play through the game multiple times, basically, and it's slightly different each time. And so you have some expectation of what the game is supposed to be like, based on your previous playthroughs, and then when that thing isn't happening, despite the fact that nothing's happened...
Yeah.
The lack of something happening is just as terrifying.
Right.
Because now you have all these questions about what actually is happening or why it's not happening. And it's particularly as you begin to realize that, good old what's-her-face, I can remember Sayori, I can remember Yuri, I can remember...
Monica?
There we go, good lord. Only Monica. Monica would kill me if she heard that. But as you begin to realize that Monica is, changing things or is somehow responsible for this, but you have no idea what that looks like, that feeling of unknownness and that what the F is happening, things are different.
Right.
Again, nothing sinister is actually happening at all.
Right.
And that in of itself is so terrifying.
It's just the fact that it's changed and violating the expectations, but also like there's nothing new happening in the story to explain what's going on.
Yeah, totally. Or, and this is slightly different and distinct, but where, Yuri disappears for a little bit, and you're like, you've already seen one of the girls kill themselves.
Right.
And you're like, and they've been building this narrative thing up a little bit. So that's another interesting thing where, you don't get to see it. Eventually you do. Which was horrifying in of itself, but that, I remember just, us being like, as it kept on going and nothing kept on happening, and we were noticing that no one was talking about it, but the fact that she was still gone was still weighing on us, as opposed to, again, any kind of overt drawing to our attention. It was the lack of drawing attention to this thing that was so scary.
It was unsettling. It's like, shouldn't we be talking about this?
I think can only, in some ways, could kind of only happen in a narrative, because we were so limited in what we could do. Like, we were noticing this thing, but we couldn't control our character and go walk out and see what was happening yet.
Right.
We had so much less agency that I feel like that feels like a far more... movies could do that, too.
Right, yeah. Movies could have, something terrible happening on screen that, the audience is aware of, but the character's not aware of.
Oh, totally. Right. Or even just, like you said, having some level of awareness of this is the way it's supposed to be going, it's clearly not going this way, what's happening, this question space that's building in the audience's mind, and they can't do anything about it, and they have to sit in it. Yeah,
they just have to wait for it to be resolved on its own time.
So it seems like negative space would be something to be far more... I think it's more difficult to pull off due to the amount of power that you have as a gamer.
Right.
And again, kind of going back to that level of control, the creator can't... The creator has to control for so many different eventualities if you have more freedom in the game.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can have that tighter narrative with less choice, which Doki Doki... Is there any, like, outside of the order that the girls go in?
Oh, I mean, I think there's a decent...
Was there a whole amount of change that you could bring to the game?
I think there was. Like, there's a decent number of different paths you can go through that game.
There? Okay.
It's just not a very, like...
I mean, obviously the narrative itself always ends the same.
Yeah, no, right? There's a good ending.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a good ending.
Really?
It's not scary, but it's like technically the good ending where if you treat all the girls equally.
What?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Is it something that you could like stumble upon, or would it be something that you'd have to like pretty much go back through the game and play?
I think you'd have to be pretty intentional about it.
Because what if you like stumbled on that one and then you're like, oh, it was just a kind of a nice game.
Well, I think it's not. Again, it's like not scary, but it's just sort of like it ends well instead of ending terribly.
And we've talked about too. Again, going back on our Doki Doki episode, talking about how it took a very, very well-established genre of that narrative kind of visual novel thing and all the expectations. You know, the narrative itself is all about that with Monika and wanting this thing and the notion of a person, you know, actually engaging with the game in that way and it being kind of potentially scary in and of itself. That is very... Just when we talk about negative space, I just think in terms of... Yeah, it is very much a postmodern, you know, kind of... Star Wars: The Last Jedi-ish.
Yeah, dismantling of all the tropes of that genre.
Of that, you know. So again, that's a if you think of like the genre as in a physical sense. I have a very specific image in my head that I'm not going to be able to convey.
Well,
in any case,
I do think it's like, so obviously visual novel games are going to live and die by their narrative, right? Because that's pretty much all they are.
Yeah.
And so here you have a visual novel where the narrative is pretty loose. It doesn't make a lot of internal sense, and like it's not like incoherent, but it's just like there's not like a lot there. It feels like you're not being told a lot, and it's just sort of. It's not satisfying. It's not substantial. Yeah, and that's really unsettling.
Yeah, no, that's a good point of even the subversion in that regard, where it is very... that game is very much one that leaves people with questions. At the end, it's not entirely clear what happened or why it happened at the end of the day, and that in of itself, too, can be a very unsettling experience for the player.
Right.
Outside of all of the sensory input that you just got, then I mean that's like a psychological. That'd be like the way that I was talking about how it's really hard to do negative space for psychological terror, and maybe that's part of it. Where it I mean, I guess that's inherent to psychological terror sometimes, with the suggestion of something being scarier than the thing itself. But
actually getting it.
But at the same time, maybe we could define that as the lack thereof, instead of supplying the thing to be scared of, allowing you to. Or the lack of understanding of that thing being the scary thing.
Yeah. Well,
this is one of our more cerebral ones, but I think we've ever done.
Yeah, I think this is really good.
That's up there with the time you tried to explain something in terms of how
reverse
computer works.
Program. Yeah. So I think that's going to pretty much do it for today, guys. It was a pretty abstract episode, so I think have fun with this idea. If you can come up with other forms of negative space or lack or deprivation and how that's used in horror games, let us know. You can email Muxel at gergenmuxel.com or Mark at gergenmuxel.com. I'll respond to either one. You can email Gerg or Greg at gergenmuxel.com.
One's even easier.
We'll get those. Yeah, just 2 letters. Even if you misspell, you can type really fast because it'll still get to it.
Odds are you'll still find it. Yeah.
So we'll see you guys next week. We're going to be doing a couple of streams later in the month, which is really, get excited for it. We're going to plan on doing at least 3 streams. One of them will be Dead Space. The other ones are unknown.
Right. So even to us, you might say that there's a negative space.
It's a negative space
planning
stream planning. It's horrific.
Do your expectations feel subverted? They shouldn't. Because we never plan that far ahead.
All right, guys. Well, take care. And be spooked.
Yes.